Hello colleagues, and welcome to this week's learning. This week I want to talk to you about several topics. I want to discuss assessment literacy and the balance of assessment and really think about our purpose for assessment. So essentially, we want to think about the purpose for assessment for all students. We never really want to assess students just to assess them. We really want to assess with a purpose or an end result in mind. So each piece of data that we collect, whether it's formative or summative, formal and informal, we always want to be thinking, how is this going to help the student? How is this balance of data going to support instruction? And in thinking about that and making sure that we have multiple views of assessment when we think about a student is one thing that is helpful is when this visual I find very helpful around assessment literacy. And this was adapted from Tammy and Claire in their text, Assessment in Perspective. And it really gives us an excellent visual in thinking about really triangulating data and thinking about that purpose for data itself. And when we use formal data, really to think about the overall achievement of students and really comparing their performance with others in a summarized way. So that formal data really being tests and quizzes and other mathematical or computerized data that we generate around students. And informal data, when we collect data, anecdotal notes, or things that involve classroom performance. So things that are really unstructured, but really are very telling around students. So even authentic student work, it's just as important as that formal data because it provides that balance that we're looking for and really helps provide multiple lenses to look at students themselves. So really in that core, we want to make sure that we're thinking about that type of data and what's its purpose, and then how do these things balance together to provide a good lens for students. And then really thinking about that diagnostic assessment, so really using and knowing what students already have learned and what they already know prior to our instruction. And then that formative data that really happens during instruction. So we're really looking at what are students doing, how are they interacting with the teaching that we're doing, and how are we sort of using that information to be able to think about where is our instruction going to be headed from this point. So really, what are they struggling with? What are the challenges for students? And then how does that impact what I'm thinking about for my next steps in planning? And then summatively, really after the instruction, that kind of assessment of learning and how does that fit within that balance of the data that we have for students. So some of that data is standardized assessments. And so they're really assessments that have happened over, that collect data over a longer period of time, they can be, and really inform how students are really comparatively doing on the same type of assessment, regardless of what classrooms they're in. So that's a different lens for us to be able to think about when we think about data. And then again, that balance of both qualitative and quantitative data. So the qualitative data are ways of collecting data that are concerned with describing meaning rather than with drawing statistical inferences. So I always think about the quantitative data being data collected with numbers, and the qualitative data really being around meaning and what are those sort of outcomes that are like conversations and that type of data, rather than quantitative data, which are really methods focused on numbers, amounts, frequencies, rather than meaning and experience. So this balance of data, or these key points, really help us to be able to think about what it is that students really need to know next. And through that collection process, we're able to balance what happens with students in instruction, both in short times for planning and over a long period of time. So summatively, in the end, how did students interact with the learning? As we move ahead, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the assessment tools listed on Blackboard for this week. So I've posted for you a few resources. There's a 10-month progression. There's also a scaffold for you to support students when you find their instructional text level. Not an exact measurement, but sort of what students need to learn within each text level. You have resources on Blackboard regarding leveled text. So what does each level look like? What are the characteristics of that level? And then finally, I'll talk to you about the case study and how this data, this balance of assessment and really taking a global view of students, really supports us in collecting data that really looks deeply at one particular student, and I'll show you how to organize that information and structure that in our upcoming weeks. So the first assessment tool that's posted on Blackboard for you is a 10-month progression, which has been developed by Fountas and Pinnell. And this isn't exact, but it's sort of an approximation over a school year in how you would look at how students are moving through a trajectory of text and sort of how long it should take students, based on your instruction and your interaction with them, about how long it will take them to move through each text level. Now, this isn't set in stone for each and every student. So obviously this is going to be differentiated based on your students' needs in your classroom, but it really helps you to think about really at each grade level about where they should start and where they should end to be on track if you're progress monitoring, and really thinking about using your assessment to think about how students are moving through that trajectory. So for our little friends in kindergarten, so many times they come in really working on those concepts of print and begin working within that level A text. So that's a very repetitive text with a lot of scaffolds for students, using pictures and very few words on one line. And typically this would be either August or September, depending on how your district decides to think about using this first month's data. And so usually by September, October, they're moving into that level A text. So they've sort of are starting to take on the concepts of print and really coming up with some level of mastery, because within that B level, we know that there's 2 to 3 words in a sentence still scaffolded by the text, and students really have that return sweep in their behaviors, and they're able to take on more texts. So if we're thinking September, October, November, December, so January is sort of that turning point where students actually start to take on and practice that balance of skills using the visual information, the meaning, and then the syntax of language to be able to support them and be able to move through a text. But they're really practicing this for 3 months. And then as they're moving towards the end of the year, they're really becoming more solid with those skills and really sort of becoming independent, and there's more text on the page, and some of that text may not be supported in its entirety by the pictures. So students are really moving beyond those initial steps as emergent readers, and then starting to work into in first grade, beginning with sort of that DE, right? That transition happens much quicker for them. And then really sort of taking on text and working through multiple pages of text, less scaffolds, as we think about what they need to work through. So this trajectory should really help you to be able to progress monitor. And as you're assessing your case study student, you may use this assessment tool to think about how close or beyond or below grade level your student is performing, even when you think about really short increments of time within months. So this next assessment tool that really will sort of help you think about where or what skills your reader has or what strategies your reader is using is this little what strategies do good readers use within each grade level. And again, this shows the authors listed below. And when you use this, you really want to think about not just levels within themselves, but sort of bands of text complexity as students begin to work within levels. So a student may be working in a level A text, but sometimes if we keep them within that level A text for too long, they actually start developing very weak strategies because they rely heavily on the pictures and they really don't pay enough attention to visual information. So they really falter and make very little progress. So as you work with these students or think about an assessment plan, an instructional plan for them using your assessment data, you really want to think about assessment to progress monitor them to really sort of work between A and B level text as you're transitioning through your instructional progression, because students are really working within A solidly, but then they might be A and B. So you might start scaffolding with some easy level B text and then supporting students within that type of work. So this tool really helps you to think about what have my students mastered? What are they doing well? What are they doing independently? What do they need my help with still? And what things have they really not mastered yet? But you may notice as you look to the next level, they may be engaging in some of this, beginning to engage in some of this work, even though they're still mastering some of this work. So don't be bound by a text level. Certainly our students are not levels. Their reading is much more complex than just a level. Many of them need language support or additional instruction in certain areas to be able to support them. But this sort of helps you in thinking about how the text is structured and what they're doing, so that when you're collecting anecdotal notes or you're really thinking about them over time, when did they start to develop these things? What are you really noticing about them? And that really helps you to be able to think, oh, are they really ready to move into that next text level or not? So you'll be able to use this in multiple grade levels. So there are many levels listed, and you can see the progression of skills continues to grow. So within a level E, they really have to be reading many high-frequency words with automaticity, recognize inflectional endings, apply phonic knowledge by blending. So this will help you to also set goals for students. So as you're thinking about what does this student really need to know, what does my assessment data tell me, and what two goals, sometimes 3 goals, can a student be working on? So I like to think about a balance of goals for students. So they may be working on some type of phonics goal, and then to balance that, they really should be working in some type of meaning goal, so that the emphasis for students just doesn't land within phonics, because then they aren't paying attention to really the essential piece of reading is really creating meaning. So that always has to hold its biggest priority for students. That always has to be their biggest priority when they're thinking about being a reader, because although they still need to decode well and accurately in order to create meaning, they still have to be able to read words with meaning in mind, or their comprehension will continue to falter, and they'll run into a place where they're simply word calling and being automatic with words, but not really thinking about that balance. So that's something we really want to pay attention to as we're setting goals for students. So this is a really helpful resource that you can use as you begin to take running records and really think about what students need next in instruction. So next, I will talk to you a little bit about the case study, and I will be putting it in a separate video in case you choose to review the case study expectations. But I really would encourage you to be able to think about some of the things when you're goal setting and you're noticing what students do well, what are their challenges, what are their strengths, in thinking about when you find that instructional level for students where they're reading with 90 to 95% accuracy, with a good, pretty good comprehension, and they could be working on their fluency. They may be very accurate, but then not putting words together, and you think that's impacting their comprehension. But really use this resource to be able to help you to set goals within your case study.